She stood at the edge of civilization with calloused hands and a heart full of dreams that seemed too big for the small frontier town behind her. Sarah Mitchell had traveled over 1,000 miles in a covered wagon, her family's entire life packed into canvas and wood, chasing whispers of fertile land and fresh starts in the Colorado Territory. But now, staring into the endless expanse of untamed wilderness that stretched beyond Pine Ridge, she wondered if courage alone would be enough to survive what lay ahead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the sky, their peaks shrouded in mist and mystery, hiding secrets that only the bravest souls dared to discover. While other settler girls sought safety in numbers and comfort in familiar routines, Sarah felt the pull of something wilder, something that called to the restless spirit her mother had spent years trying to tame. Then Jacob Carter emerged from the treeline like a force of nature himself, a mountain man whose very presence seemed to command the wilderness around him. He'd been watching the new arrivals for days, assessing their chances of survival with the cold calculation of someone who'd seen too many dreamers broken by the reality of frontier life. Most settlers lasted one hard winter before retreating to easier lands, but something about the young woman standing alone at the settlement's edge caught his attention. She didn't cower from the vastness before her. Instead, she studied it with the intensity of someone planning conquest rather than surrender. When their eyes met across the clearing, Jacob knew immediately that this girl was different, and that difference would either make her the strongest woman he'd ever encountered, or destroy her completely in the attempt. The wagon wheels had been silent for 3 days now, but Sarah Mitchell could still feel their constant rhythm echoing in her bones as she stood outside Henderson's general store, watching the morning mist rise from the valleys beyond Pine Ridge. 21 years old and every inch her father's daughter, she possessed the kind of determined spirit that made seasoned frontiersmen take notice and proper ladies whisper concerns behind their fans. Her auburn hair caught the early sunlight as she studied the mountain peaks, and Thomas Mitchell recognized the expression on her face as the same one she'd worn as a child when contemplating which tree was too tall to climb or which creek was too swift to cross. The journey from Illinois had taken 2 months of backbreaking travel, their wagon train one of dozens heading west in search of opportunity and freedom from the constraints of civilized society. Most families sought farmland in the gentler valleys, but Thomas Mitchell had heard stories of rich soil hidden in the higher elevations, protected valleys where a man could build something lasting away from the crowds and complications of established settlements. Sarah had been the only one in their family who truly embraced the adventure, while her mother Rebecca spent most of the journey cataloging everything they'd left behind, and her younger brother David complained endlessly about the discomfort and uncertainty. Pine Ridge represented everything the Mitchell family had imagined when they decided to leave their comfortable but limiting life behind. The settlement boasted nearly 200 residents, a general store, a church, a school, and even a small bank run by the prosperous Brooks family. Main Street bustled with activity as merchants and farmers conducted their daily business, while the surrounding hills showed promising signs of mineral deposits that had attracted miners and investors from back east. For most settler families, Pine Ridge would have been the perfect destination, offering enough civilization to feel safe while providing plenty of opportunity for ambitious newcomers. But Sarah found herself drawn repeatedly to the edges of town, where the cultivated safety of settlement life gave way to the wild unknown of the high country. She'd grown up on stories of mountain men and trappers, legendary figures who lived by their wits and their will in territories where only the strongest survived. While other young women her age focused on finding suitable husbands and establishing proper households, Sarah dreamed of exploring the uncharted regions beyond the mapped territory, of discovering valleys that had never felt the bite of a plow or heard the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. Her fascination with the wilderness had begun during the wagon train journey, when their guide had pointed out signs of the mountain men who occasionally traded with the settlements, tracks that told stories of incredible journeys through impossible terrain, campsites that revealed the skills necessary to survive in conditions that would kill lesser men within days, and always the sense that somewhere in those distant peaks lived individuals who had chosen freedom over security and thrived in the choice. Sarah had peppered their guide with questions until he'd finally admitted that he'd encountered these legendary figures only a few times in 20 years of guiding wagon trains, and each meeting had left him with profound respect for their capabilities and their commitment to living entirely on their own terms. The reality of Pine Ridge life had proven more restrictive than Sarah had anticipated during those long weeks of travel and dreaming. Her family had purchased a small farmstead 2 miles outside town, and the work of establishing their new life consumed every daylight hour with tasks that felt mundane compared to the adventures she'd imagined. Planting vegetables, tending chickens, helping her mother establish the routines that would carry them through their first winter in Colorado territory. The neighboring families were kind and welcoming, but their conversations centered on crop yields and weather patterns, and the endless social intricacies that seemed to follow civilization wherever it established itself. Samuel Brooks, the banker's son and Pine Ridge's most eligible bachelor, had made his interest in Sarah embarrassingly clear within days of the Mitchell family's arrival. Handsome in a soft way that spoke of comfortable living and protected upbringing, Samuel possessed all the qualities that should have made him an ideal match for a settler's daughter. He was educated, financially secure, socially prominent, and genuinely kind in his attentions. When he spoke of their potential future together, he painted pictures of a life that many young women would have found appealing: a fine house in town, servants to handle the rougher work, children educated in proper schools, and the security that came with established social position. But Samuel's vision of their future always seemed to involve Sarah setting aside the very qualities that made her who she was. When she mentioned her interest in exploring the higher valleys, he smiled indulgently and suggested that such curiosities would naturally fade once she had a household to manage. When she asked about the mountain men and trappers, he dismissed them as rough characters unsuitable for polite conversation. Most telling of all, when she spoke of her dreams of seeing the unmapped territories beyond the established settlements, Samuel grew visibly uncomfortable and changed the subject to safer topics like church socials and garden parties. The social pressure to accept Samuel's eventual proposal came from multiple directions. Rebecca Mitchell, still adjusting to the radical change from their orderly Illinois life, saw Samuel as a return to respectability and security for her daughter. The other settler families viewed the potential match as a smart alliance that would benefit everyone involved. Even Thomas Mitchell, despite his own adventurous spirit, recognized the practical advantages of having his daughter married to the most prosperous young man in the territory. Everyone seemed to assume that Sarah would naturally want what every sensible young woman wanted: safety, status, and the comfortable predictability of a conventional life. But Sarah found herself growing more restless with each passing week, feeling trapped by expectations that—
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Had followed them even to the supposedly free frontier. The routine of settlement life felt like a cage disguised as security, and she caught herself staring toward the mountains with increasing frequency, wondering what lay beyond the highest visible peaks. The wilderness called to something deep in her spirit, something that conventional society seemed determined to suppress in favor of more acceptable feminine pursuits. She began taking longer walks alone, venturing closer to the treeline and imagining what it would be like to simply keep walking until she found whatever it was that the mountains held for those brave enough to seek it. The warning came from old Pete Wilson, a grizzled former trapper who spent his retirement years sharing stories and supplies with anyone willing to listen to his tales of the old days. Sarah had befriended Pete during her explorations around town, fascinated by his accounts of life in the high country before the settlers arrived in significant numbers. Pete had lived the kind of existence that Sarah dreamed about, spending decades in the wilderness with only his skills and his courage for protection. His weathered hands bore scars from 100 adventures, and his eyes held the clarity that came from years of depending entirely on his own judgment for survival. When Pete noticed Sarah's increasing restlessness and her pointed questions about life in the unmapped territories, he felt obligated to offer some hard truths about the realities of wilderness living. The mountains weren't just beautiful and challenging, he explained, they were genuinely dangerous in ways that could kill the unprepared without warning or mercy. Weather patterns that changed from pleasant to deadly within hours, terrain that demanded perfect judgment and flawless execution, wildlife that viewed humans as either threats to be eliminated or food to be consumed. Most importantly, Pete warned, the isolation could break even strong minds, leaving people lost in ways that had nothing to do with physical location. But Pete also recognized something in Sarah that reminded him of the few individuals he'd known who truly belonged in the wilderness. She listened to his warnings with the serious attention they deserved, but instead of being discouraged, she asked detailed questions about skills and preparation. When he described the mental toughness required to survive months alone in the high country, Sarah nodded with understanding rather than fear. Most significantly, when Pete talked about the profound freedom that came with wilderness living, Sarah's eyes lit up with recognition, as if he was describing something she'd always known she was meant to experience. The conversation that changed everything happened on a morning when Sarah had risen before dawn to walk the perimeter of their farmstead, restless energy driving her to seek solitude and space to think clearly about her future. The mist hung heavy in the valleys, and the silence was so complete that even her footsteps seemed to echo among the trees. She'd walked farther than usual, drawn by the sound of running water that promised a creek or stream she hadn't yet discovered. Following the sound deeper into the forest, Sarah found herself in a small clearing, where the morning light filtered through the pine branches in shafts of gold and green. That's when she saw him. Jacob Carter stood at the edge of the clearing like he'd been carved from the wilderness itself, so perfectly still that Sarah's eyes passed over him twice before recognizing the human form among the trees. Tall and lean with the kind of strength that came from years of physical challenges, he wore buckskin clothing that had been weathered to the color of bark and leaves. His dark hair was longer than any civilized man would wear, and his beard was trimmed but wild, framing a face that looked like it had been shaped by wind and weather and countless nights under open sky. Most striking of all were his eyes, pale blue and startlingly alert, studying Sarah with the same careful attention she'd seen him give to animal tracks and weather signs. For a long moment, neither moved nor spoke, each taking the measure of the other across the small clearing. Sarah felt her heart racing, not with fear but with recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting her entire life for this exact encounter. Jacob saw a young woman who belonged in the wilderness in ways she probably didn't even understand yet, someone whose spirit matched the untamed country that had shaped his own life. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. The mountain man's words would echo in Sarah's mind for days afterward, challenging everything she thought she knew about herself and her future. Standing in that misty clearing with the sound of running water providing nature's soundtrack, Jacob Carter had looked directly into her eyes and spoken a truth that cut through all her confusion and social pressure with startling clarity. He'd seen something in her that no one else had recognized, something that matched the wilderness itself in its fierce independence and untamed potential. When Jacob finally stepped forward, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to read every subtlety of terrain and weather, Sarah understood that this moment would divide her life into before and after. Everything that had seemed important about Pine Ridge society, and Samuel Brooks and her family's expectations suddenly felt distant and artificial compared to the reality of standing face to face with someone who lived entirely on his own terms. The mountains had sent her exactly what she'd been seeking without knowing how to name it, proof that the kind of life she dreamed about was not only possible, but was being lived by someone who'd found the courage to choose freedom over security. Jacob's presence filled the clearing with possibilities that Sarah had never dared to voice aloud, dreams that seemed too wild and dangerous for a proper settler's daughter to entertain. But looking into his weather-beaten face and seeing the respect in his eyes as he evaluated her potential, Sarah felt something shift deep in her spirit. For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, she wasn't trying to fit herself into someone else's vision of what her life should become. Instead, she was being seen for exactly who she was, and that person was being found worthy of consideration for adventures that would test every ounce of strength and courage she possessed. The morning mist continued to rise around them as two very different worlds stood poised to collide, each representative carrying the hopes and dreams that had brought them to this moment of recognition. Sarah Mitchell, the settler girl who'd never quite fit the conventional mold, and Jacob Carter, the mountain man who'd chosen the wilderness over civilization, faced each other across a clearing that suddenly felt like the center of the universe. Neither yet understood how completely this encounter would reshape their understanding of what was possible, but both sensed that they stood at the threshold of something that would demand everything they had to give and offer rewards beyond anything they'd previously imagined. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities that seemed too large and dangerous to voice aloud, while the Colorado wilderness watched and waited to see if two strong spirits would find the courage to build something together that neither could create alone. Part 2. The impossible vision. Sarah Mitchell had always been the kind of person who saw possibilities where others saw obstacles, but even she understood that what Jacob Carter was suggesting bordered on madness. Standing in that pine-scented clearing with morning dew still clinging to her skirts, she listened as the mountain man outlined a vision that would have sent any sensible woman running back to the safety of Pine Ridge as fast as her legs could carry her. He spoke of valleys hidden so deep in the high country that they'd never appeared on any surveyor's map, places where a person could live entirely free from the rules and restrictions that governed civilized society. The challenge he laid before her wasn't subtle or gentle. Jacob Carter didn't believe in wrapping hard truths in comfortable lies, and his assessment of what wilderness living demanded was brutally honest. He described winters that could trap a person for months at a time, where a single mistake in preparation or judgment could mean the difference between survival and death. He talked about the physical demands of building shelter with nothing but hand tools and determination, of hunting and trapping for sustenance, of navigating terrain that could shift from merely difficult to absolutely treacherous with little warning. Most men would have assumed that such realities would discourage any woman from serious consideration of wilderness life. Mountain living wasn't just challenging, it was dangerous in ways that required constant vigilance and complete self-reliance. There were no neighbors to call upon in emergencies, no stores to provide supplies when careful planning fell short, no doctors to treat injuries or illnesses that could easily prove fatal in isolated conditions. The kind of existence Jacob described would test every skill Sarah possessed and demand that she develop capabilities she'd never needed in civilized settings. But as Jacob spoke, Sarah felt something awakening in her spirit that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This was exactly what she'd been searching for without knowing how to name it. The conventional life that awaited her in Pine Ridge, comfortable and secure as it might be, felt like a slow suffocation compared to the vivid reality Jacob painted of wilderness living. Yes, the challenges would be enormous, but they would be honest challenges that demanded growth and strength rather than conformity and compromise. The mountain man's description of his daily existence revealed a life lived entirely on his own terms, where success and failure depended solely on his own skills and decisions. He rose each morning to face whatever challenges the wilderness presented, whether that meant tracking game through difficult terrain, repairing equipment with improvised materials, or simply surviving weather conditions that could humble the most experienced outdoorsman. Every day brought the possibility of real adventure, genuine accomplishment, and the kind of freedom that civilized society seemed determined to eliminate in favor of predictable routine. Jacob's home, as he described it, sounded like something from a fairy tale, but a fairy tale written for adults who understood that the most beautiful things often came with the highest costs. His cabin sat in a hidden valley accessible only through a narrow canyon that required expert knowledge of the route to navigate safely. The valley itself was a natural fortress, protected by peaks that rose so steeply that only the most determined travelers could find their way in or out. Inside this protected space, he'd created a life that combined the best aspects of solitude and self-sufficiency. The cabin had been built entirely by his own hands using timber from the surrounding forest, stone from the creek bed, and techniques he'd learned from other mountain men during his early years in the high country. Every beam and board had been cut and shaped to his exact specifications, every room designed to serve multiple purposes with maximum efficiency. The result was a dwelling that felt more like a natural extension of the landscape than an intrusion upon it, a place where a person could live comfortably, while remaining completely connected to the rhythms of the wilderness. Sarah found herself captivated by Jacob's description of the seasonal cycles that governed wilderness life. Spring brought the excitement of emergence from winter's isolation, the opportunity to assess what had survived the harsh months and begin planning for the year ahead. Summer meant long days of hunting and gathering, building and repairing, taking advantage of favorable weather to accomplish everything that would be impossible during the darker months. Fall required intense preparation for winter, gathering supplies and completing projects before the snows made travel treacherous. Winter itself became a time of reflection and planning, of living off careful preparation while the world outside remained locked in ice and snow. The rhythm Jacob described appealed to something deep in Sarah's nature that had never found expression in civilized life. She'd always felt most alive when facing genuine challenges, when her skills and determination were tested against real obstacles rather than social conventions. The seasonal progression of wilderness living offered exactly the kind of authentic existence she'd been craving, where each day brought meaningful work and genuine accomplishment rather than the artificial busy work that seemed to consume most people's lives. But Jacob's vision extended beyond mere survival or even comfortable self-sufficiency. He spoke of the profound peace that came with living in harmony with natural forces rather than constantly fighting against them. In the wilderness, he explained, a person learned to read the subtle signs that revealed weather patterns, animal behavior and seasonal changes. This knowledge became second nature, creating a connection between human consciousness and natural rhythms that civilized people had forgotten existed. The mental challenges of wilderness living fascinated Sarah almost as much as the physical demands. Jacob described the clarity of thought that came from depending entirely on one's own judgment, the way that constant contact with genuine consequences sharpened decision-making skills, and eliminated the fuzzy thinking that comfortable living seemed to encourage. In the wilderness there was no room for self-deception or wishful thinking. Reality imposed itself with uncompromising honesty, and survival depended on accepting and working with that reality rather than trying to ignore or reshape it. Sarah understood intuitively that what Jacob was offering her wasn't just a different way of living, but a completely different way of being human. Civilized society seemed designed to insulate people from the natural consequences of their choices, creating artificial environments where mediocrity was not only tolerated but often rewarded. Wilderness living demanded excellence not as an abstract ideal but as a practical necessity for survival. Every skill had to be mastered completely, every decision had to be made with full awareness of its potential consequences, every day had to be lived with the kind of attention and intention that most people reserved for special occasions. The transformation that such a life would require both thrilled and sobered Sarah as she contemplated Jacob's challenge. She would need to develop physical capabilities far beyond anything her upbringing had prepared her for, learning to handle tools and weapons with expert precision, to navigate difficult terrain with confidence, to endure hardships that would test her mental and emotional resilience as much as her physical strength. More fundamentally, she would need to shed the psychological dependencies that civilized living had created, learning to trust her own judgment completely, and to find satisfaction in accomplishments that no one else might ever witness or appreciate. The prospect of such complete self-reliance both excited and intimidated Sarah as she stood listening to Jacob's matter-of-fact description of wilderness realities. She'd always prided herself on her independence, but she was beginning to understand that what she'd considered independence was actually just a more comfortable form of dependence on social structures and safety nets that she'd taken for granted. True independence, as Jacob lived it, meant taking complete responsibility for every aspect of one's existence and finding the strength to thrive under conditions that would overwhelm most people. Jacob's challenge wasn't presented as a romantic invitation or a gentle suggestion that she might enjoy trying something new. Instead, he laid out the realities of wilderness living with the clinical precision of someone who'd seen too many people fail because they hadn't understood what they were attempting. He made it clear that what he was offering would demand everything she had to give and more, that there would be no room for half measures or gradual adjustments. Either she was strong enough for the wilderness or she wasn't. Either she could commit completely to a life that offered no guarantees beyond what her own capabilities could provide, or she should return to the comfortable predictability of conventional existence. The choice Jacob presented wasn't between good and bad options but between two completely different philosophies of how to live a human life. The conventional path offered security, social approval, and the comfortable routine of civilized society, but it also meant accepting limitations on what she could become and accomplish. The wilderness path offered unlimited possibility for growth and achievement, but it demanded that she risk everything she'd been taught to value in exchange for something she couldn't fully understand until she'd experienced it herself. Standing in that morning clearing with mist rising around them and the sound of running water providing nature's commentary on their conversation, Sarah felt the weight of a decision that would determine not just what she did with her life, but who she would become as a person. Jacob Carter had shown her a vision of existence that matched her deepest dreams and challenged her greatest fears, offering her the chance to discover whether the strength she'd always suspected lived within her was real enough to sustain her through the ultimate test of wilderness living. Part 3. The Unexpected Encounter. The encounter that would change everything began 3 days later when Sarah found herself once again drawn to the forest edge, this time carrying a leather satchel filled with questions she'd written down in her careful script. Sleep had been elusive since her meeting with Jacob Carter, her mind churning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. She'd told no one about the mountain man's challenge, knowing instinctively that sharing it would only invite advice she wasn't ready to hear and pressure she wasn't prepared to resist. Rebecca Mitchell had noticed her daughter's distraction during their evening meal preparations, commenting on Sarah's tendency to stare toward the mountains with an expression that reminded her uncomfortably of Thomas during his most restless moods. The observation had been delivered with the gentle concern of a mother who'd learned to recognize the signs of wanderlust in her family, but it carried an undertone of worry that spoke to Rebecca's own fears about their new life in the territory. Sarah had deflected her mother's concerns with vague references to adjusting to their new surroundings, but she knew the explanation wouldn't satisfy Rebecca's maternal instincts for long. The truth was that Sarah felt as though she was living in two worlds simultaneously, going through the motions of settlement life while her thoughts remained focused on Jacob's description of the hidden valley and the life he'd built there. Every domestic task felt artificial and temporary, as if she was merely playing a role while waiting for her real life to begin. The questions in her satchel ranged from practical concerns about wilderness survival to deeper inquiries about the psychological challenges of isolation. Sarah had always been methodical in her approach to important decisions, gathering information and considering all angles before committing to a course of action. Jacob's challenge represented the most significant choice she'd ever faced, and she was determined to understand exactly what she would be accepting or refusing before making her final decision. She'd chosen the early morning hours for this return visit because the forest felt most alive during the transition from darkness to light, when the nocturnal creatures were settling into rest and the day shift was beginning to stir. The quality of silence was different at dawn, deeper and more complete than at any other time, creating an atmosphere that seemed conducive to serious conversation. Sarah wanted to hear Jacob's answers to her questions without the distractions that daylight hours might bring. The creek where they'd first met was running higher than before, fed by snowmelt from the peaks that had accelerated during several days of unseasonably warm weather. Sarah seated herself on the same fallen log she'd noticed during their previous encounter, arranging her skirts carefully and pulling out the first page of her written questions. She'd learned patience during the long wagon train journey, and she was prepared to wait as long as necessary for Jacob to appear. The mountain man's arrival was announced by the subtle shift in forest sounds that Sarah was beginning to recognize as his signature. Birds didn't fall silent when Jacob approached, but their calls changed in ways that spoke to the presence of someone who belonged in their environment rather than intruding upon it. When he materialized from the treeline, Sarah realized that he'd probably been watching her for several minutes before revealing himself, a habit that spoke to the caution that kept mountain men alive in dangerous territory. Jacob's greeting was characteristically direct, acknowledging her return without expressing surprise or curiosity about her reasons for coming back. He settled onto a boulder across the creek from her position, close enough for conversation but maintaining the physical distance that seemed to be his natural preference. His pale eyes took in the satchel of papers without comment, but Sarah sensed his approval of her methodical approach to gathering information before making such an important decision. The first questions Sarah posed were deliberately practical, focusing on the specific skills and knowledge that wilderness living would require. She wanted to understand exactly what she would need to learn and how long such education might take. Jacob's responses revealed the depth and complexity of wilderness survival in ways that his initial challenge had only hinted at. Every aspect of mountain living demanded expertise that took years to develop fully, from reading weather patterns that could shift without warning to understanding animal behavior well enough to avoid dangerous encounters. Jacob described the process of learning to hunt not just as a matter of marksmanship, but as a complex skill that required understanding game trails, feeding patterns, seasonal movements, and dozens of other factors that determine success or failure. A mountain man needed to be able to track wounded animals through difficult terrain, to field dress game efficiently in all weather conditions, and to preserve meat without access to conventional storage methods. These were skills that demanded both physical capabilities and mental acuity, requiring constant practice and refinement. The challenge of food procurement extended far beyond hunting to include gathering wild plants, fishing in mountain streams, and maintaining emergency supplies for periods when fresh food wasn't available. Jacob explained that a wilderness dweller needed to become an expert botanist, able to identify edible plants reliably while avoiding those that could cause illness or death. Such knowledge varied significantly with elevation and season, requiring continuous learning and absolute precision in application. Sarah's questions about shelter and construction revealed another layer of complexity in wilderness living. Jacob described the process of selecting appropriate sites for buildings, taking into account factors like drainage, wind patterns, exposure to weather, and proximity to water sources. The actual construction demanded skills in working with hand tools, understanding structural engineering principles, and improvising solutions when conventional materials weren't available. A mountain man had to be carpenter, engineer, and architect rolled into one, capable of creating structures that would withstand extreme weather conditions, using only resources available in the immediate environment. The conversation turned to the psychological challenges of isolation, a topic that Sarah approached with particular interest. She'd always enjoyed solitude more than most people, but she understood that the kind of isolation Jacob described was qualitatively different from anything she'd experienced. Jacob spoke thoughtfully about the mental disciplines required to maintain emotional equilibrium during long periods without human contact, describing techniques for managing loneliness, boredom, and the various forms of mental distress that could affect people living alone in challenging conditions. Jacob's description of winter isolation was particularly sobering. For months at a time, weather conditions could make travel impossible, trapping a person in their shelter with only their own resources for entertainment, mental stimulation, and emotional support. The successful wilderness dweller learned to find satisfaction in solitary activities, to maintain mental sharpness through self-directed learning and problem-solving, and to develop the inner strength necessary to endure periods of genuine hardship, without losing hope or determination. But Jacob also described the profound rewards that came with mastering the psychological challenges of wilderness living. The clarity of thought that developed from extended periods of solitude, the deep sense of peace that came from living in harmony with natural rhythms, and the unshakable confidence that resulted from knowing one could survive and thrive under the most challenging conditions. These psychological benefits weren't abstract or theoretical, Jacob explained, but practical advantages that affected every aspect of daily life. Sarah found herself particularly intrigued by Jacob's description of the decision-making process that wilderness living demanded. In civilized society, most important choices could be delayed, reconsidered, or modified based on changing circumstances. In the wilderness, decisions often had to be made quickly based on incomplete information, and the consequences of poor judgment could be severe and immediate. This reality forced a person to develop excellent judgment and strong intuitive abilities, but it also meant accepting a level of personal responsibility that most people found overwhelming. The conversation gradually moved beyond practical considerations to explore the philosophical implications of choosing wilderness life over conventional existence. Jacob spoke of the profound freedom that came with depending entirely on one's own capabilities, the way that such complete self-reliance changed a person's relationship with themselves and their environment. In civilized society, he observed, people often live their entire lives without discovering their true capabilities, because they never faced situations that demanded their full potential. Sarah listened with growing fascination as Jacob described the process of psychological transformation that wilderness living facilitated. Stripped of social supports and artificial comforts, a person discovered which aspects of their personality were essential, and which were merely cultural constructions. The result was a kind of authenticity that was rare in civilized settings, where social expectations often prevented people from expressing their true nature fully. As the morning progressed, Sarah realized that her questions were revealing as much about herself as Jacob's answers were teaching her about wilderness living. Her methodical approach to gathering information, her focus on practical considerations over romantic ideals, and her serious consideration of psychological challenges all demonstrated the kind of realistic thinking that wilderness life demanded. Jacob seemed to recognize these qualities as well, his responses becoming more detailed and encouraging as their conversation continued. The most significant moment of their second encounter came when Jacob posed a question of his own, challenging Sarah to examine her motivations for considering such a radical change in lifestyle. He wanted to understand whether her interest in wilderness living came from a genuine calling toward that way of life, or simply from dissatisfaction with conventional alternatives. The distinction was crucial, he explained, because wilderness living demanded positive motivation rather than negative reaction to thrive successfully. Sarah's response surprised them both with its clarity and conviction. She spoke of the sense of incompleteness that had haunted her throughout her life in civilized society, the feeling that she was capable of more than her circumstances allowed her to express. Wilderness living appealed to her not as an escape from something unpleasant, but as an opportunity to discover and develop her full potential in an environment that would demand everything she had to give. When their conversation finally concluded, Sarah understood that she was no longer simply considering Jacob's challenge but actively preparing to accept it. The practical questions she'd brought had been answered thoroughly, but more importantly, the deeper questions about her own readiness and motivation had been resolved through the process of serious discussion with someone who understood the realities involved. As she gathered her papers and prepared to return to Pine Ridge, Sarah felt the calm certainty that comes with making a difficult decision, and knowing it's the right one. Part 4, Clash of Worlds. The collision between Sarah's growing commitment to wilderness life and Pine Ridge society's expectations came to a head during the monthly church social, when Samuel Brooks chose to make his intentions towards Sarah embarrassingly public. The gathering had been planned as a celebration of the community's growing prosperity, with families contributing their finest dishes and wearing their best clothes to demonstrate how successfully civilization had taken root in the Colorado Territory. For Sarah, the event served as a stark reminder of exactly what she would be leaving behind when she accepted Jacob's challenge. Samuel had spent weeks preparing for this moment, consulting with his mother about the proper approach and even traveling to Denver to purchase a ring that would demonstrate both his serious intentions and his family's financial capabilities. He'd arranged for the announcement to be made during the evening program, when the entire community would be gathered together to hear testimonials about their shared success in taming the wilderness and building something permanent in what had recently been untamed territory. The irony of Samuel's timing wasn't lost on Sarah as she sat in the decorated church hall, listening to speaker after speaker praise the virtues of civilized society and the importance of establishing proper communities in frontier regions. Every speech seemed designed to reinforce the idea that progress meant replacing wilderness with cultivation, that success could be measured by how completely natural landscapes had been transformed into familiar patterns of European American settlement. Reverend Hayes delivered the evening's keynote address, focusing on the moral imperative of bringing Christian civilization to the frontier, and the responsibility of each family to contribute to the community's growth and stability. His sermon painted wilderness as something to be conquered rather than appreciated, a collection of obstacles and dangers that needed to be overcome through human ingenuity and divine guidance. The mountain men and trappers who lived beyond civilization's boundaries were portrayed as tragic figures who'd lost their way, abandoning the benefits of community life for the false freedom of isolation. Sarah found herself growing increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed, realizing that every value being celebrated represented something she was preparing to reject: the security of community life, the comfort of social conventions, the pride in technological progress, the satisfaction of economic achievement. All of these things were being held up as evidence of human advancement, while the lifestyle she was contemplating was implicitly criticized as regression toward primitive conditions. When Samuel finally rose to make his announcement, the gathered community responded with the enthusiastic approval that such occasions demanded. His speech was carefully crafted to emphasize not just his personal feelings for Sarah, but the broader significance of their potential union for Pine Ridge's future. He spoke of building something lasting together, of raising children who would carry forward the community's values, and of contributing to the civilization project that had brought them all to the Colorado Territory. The ring Samuel presented was indeed impressive, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the lamplight and drew admiring gasps from the assembled women. Rebecca Mitchell's face glowed with maternal pride and relief, while Thomas Mitchell nodded approvingly at the match that would secure his daughter's future in terms that any reasonable person would recognize as advantageous. The entire community seemed to exhale collectively, satisfied that one of their young people was making the kind of sensible choice that would strengthen their social fabric. Sarah's response to Samuel's proposal sent a shockwave through the gathering that revealed just how far her thinking had diverged from community expectations. Instead of the gracious acceptance that everyone anticipated, she asked for time to consider his offer, explaining that such an important decision deserved careful thought rather than an immediate emotional response. The request was reasonable on its surface, but something in Sarah's tone suggested that she wasn't simply being properly cautious about accepting an advantageous proposal. The conversation that followed Samuel's public proposal continued privately on the Mitchell family's porch later that evening, with Rebecca and Thomas struggling to understand their daughter's hesitation about accepting what appeared to be an ideal match. Samuel was everything they'd hoped for in a son-in-law: prosperous, stable, well-regarded in the community, and genuinely caring in his treatment of Sarah. His proposal represented security and social advancement for their daughter, along with the comfortable certainty of a conventional life lived within established social boundaries. Sarah's attempt to explain her reservations without revealing her conversations with Jacob proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. How could she tell her parents that she found the very security they valued so highly felt like a trap? How could she explain that Samuel's vision of their future together, comfortable and predictable as it was, seemed like a kind of spiritual death compared to the possibilities Jacob had shown her? The values that made Samuel an excellent catch by conventional standards, his stability, his social connections, his predictable ambitions, were precisely the qualities that made him unsuitable for the kind of life Sarah was discovering she truly wanted. The argument that ensued revealed the depth of the philosophical divide that had opened between Sarah and her family. Rebecca couldn't understand how her daughter could even consider rejecting a proposal that offered everything a sensible woman should want: the security of marriage to a prosperous man, the respectability of an established position in community society, the comfort of a life lived according to well-understood rules and expectations. These things represented the fulfillment of every dream that had motivated their journey west. Thomas approached the situation with the pragmatic reasoning that had guided his own life decisions. He acknowledged Sarah's right to careful consideration, but he also pointed out the practical realities that made Samuel's proposal particularly attractive. Marriage to the banker's son would provide financial security that would protect Sarah from the hardships that claimed so many frontier women. It would also give her children advantages that would be impossible to provide through other means, including education and social connections that could open doors throughout their lives. The generational conflict became more apparent as the conversation continued late into the night. Rebecca and Thomas had spent their adult lives working toward exactly the kind of security and respectability that Samuel represented. They'd sacrificed immediate gratification for long-term stability, chosen practical considerations over romantic impulses, and built their entire understanding of success around the accumulation of social and economic advantages. From their perspective, Sarah's hesitation about accepting such an advantageous proposal suggested dangerous impracticality and ingratitude for the opportunities their sacrifices had made possible. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of needing to defend choices she couldn't fully explain without revealing information she wasn't ready to share. Her conversations with Jacob had opened her eyes to possibilities that her parents couldn't imagine, but those possibilities remained theoretical until she actually committed to pursuing them. She was asking her family to trust her judgment about rejecting something concrete and advantageous in favor of something that sounded like romantic fantasy when described in abstract terms. The community's response to Sarah's request for time to consider Samuel's proposal added another layer of pressure to an already difficult situation. Pine Ridge was the kind of close-knit society where everyone's business became community property, and Sarah's hesitation about accepting such an obviously suitable proposal generated considerable discussion and speculation. Some attributed her caution to proper feminine modesty, but others began to question whether Sarah Mitchell fully appreciated the advantages she was being offered. Martha Brooks, Samuel's mother, paid a visit to Rebecca Mitchell the following afternoon, ostensibly to discuss wedding preparations but actually to assess whether there were any obstacles to her son's suit that needed to be addressed. The conversation was conducted with the polite indirection that such delicate social negotiations required, but its underlying purpose was clear enough. Martha wanted to understand whether Sarah's hesitation reflected some previously unknown objection to the match, or simply the natural caution of a young woman facing such an important decision. Rebecca found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending her daughter's request for additional time while privately sharing Martha's concerns about Sarah's apparent lack of enthusiasm for such an advantageous proposal. She assured Martha that Sarah was simply being thorough in her consideration, but she couldn't entirely disguise her own worries about her daughter's mysterious reluctance to embrace what appeared to be a perfect solution to her future security and happiness. The pressure intensified when several other community matrons made casual visits to the Mitchell farm, each offering subtle advice about the importance of practical considerations in marriage decisions. These well-meaning interventions were motivated by genuine concern for Sarah's welfare, but they also reflected the community's investment in seeing their young people make choices that reinforced shared values and strengthened social bonds. Sarah's hesitation was becoming a community concern rather than a private family matter. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself returning repeatedly to the forest edge, seeking the clarity that seemed to evaporate whenever she was surrounded by the social pressures of Pine Ridge life. Her conversations with Jacob had given her a framework for understanding her dissatisfaction with conventional options, but translating that understanding into action required a level of courage that tested her commitment to living authentically rather than safely. The contrast between the two worlds competing for her allegiance became more stark with each passing day. Pine Ridge represented security, social approval, and the comfortable predictability of a life lived according to established patterns. Samuel's proposal offered her a clearly defined role with understood expectations and rewards. She would be a banker's wife, a pillar of community society, a mother raising children to take their place in the civilized world her generation was building in the wilderness. Jacob's alternative offered none of these certainties. Choosing wilderness life meant accepting risks that could result in genuine hardship or even death. It meant rejecting social approval in favor of personal authenticity, trading security for freedom, and choosing growth over comfort. Most significantly, it meant trusting her own judgment completely, without the safety net of community support or social conventions to fall back on when difficulties arose. The weight of choosing between these alternatives grew heavier as Sarah realized that her decision would affect not just her own future, but her family's position in the community and their understanding of what their journey west had been meant to accomplish. Rejecting Samuel's proposal would require her to disappoint people she loved and respected, people who'd sacrificed significantly to provide her with opportunities she seemed determined to waste. But accepting Samuel's proposal would require her to betray the growing certainty that she was meant for something different from conventional life, something that would demand every capability she possessed and challenge her to become more than social expectations allowed. The choice was becoming clear, even as its consequences remained terrifyingly uncertain. Part 5. The Hidden Wounds. The truth about Sarah's resistance to conventional life lay buried in memories she'd spent years trying to forget, wounds that had shaped her understanding of what marriage and social conformity could cost a woman who dared to want more than society deemed appropriate. The reckoning with her past began on a gray morning when she discovered her mother reading a letter that had arrived on the weekly mail coach, Rebecca's face pale with emotions that ranged from shock to angry disappointment. The letter had come from Chicago, written by Sarah's Aunt Margaret in response to Rebecca's enthusiastic description of Samuel Brooks's proposal, and their hopes for Sarah's advantageous marriage. Margaret's reply contained information that Rebecca had hoped would never reach their new life in Colorado territory. Details about the real reasons behind Sarah's fierce determination to avoid the kind of conventional marriage that had destroyed her aunt's life and nearly claimed Sarah herself as a secondary victim. Margaret Sullivan had been the pride of their family 15 years earlier, beautiful and intelligent in everything that society valued in a young woman of good breeding. She'd married well, choosing a prosperous businessman who offered security, social position, and the promise of a comfortable life lived according to the best traditions of civilized society. For the first few years of marriage, Margaret had seemed to embody everything that conventional wisdom promised women who made sensible choices and embraced their proper roles as wives and mothers. But Margaret's husband had turned out to be one of those men who viewed marriage as a form of ownership rather than partnership, who expected complete compliance with his decisions and absolute submission to his authority in all matters. What had appeared to be protective care during their courtship revealed itself as controlling domination once Margaret was legally bound to him. Her opinions became irrelevant, her interests were dismissed as frivolous, and her independence was systematically eliminated until she existed only as an extension of her husband's will and social position. Sarah had spent several summers with Margaret during her early teenage years, witnessing firsthand the slow spiritual death that accompanied a marriage where one partner's identity was gradually absorbed into the other's expectations. Margaret had once been vibrant and curious, full of ideas and dreams that extended beyond domestic concerns. By the time Sarah knew her well, Margaret had become a ghost of her former self, going through the motions of social propriety while her essential self remained locked away in some unreachable inner sanctuary. The breaking point had come when Margaret attempted to assert some small measure of independence by joining a women's literary society against her husband's wishes. The consequences had been swift and devastating. Margaret's husband had not only forbidden her participation, but had used his social and business connections to ensure that she was excluded from most community activities, effectively isolating her from any source of support or stimulation beyond his direct control. The message was clear: even the smallest assertion of independent will would be met with punishment designed to reinforce his absolute authority. Sarah had been staying with Margaret during the aftermath of this incident, and she'd seen the defeat in her aunt's eyes as the older woman finally accepted that resistance was futile. Margaret had explained to her young niece that some women were strong enough to fight such battles and win, but that she lacked the courage or resources necessary to challenge a system that gave husbands nearly unlimited power over their wives' lives. The price of continued resistance would be complete social exile and probable economic ruin, costs that Margaret couldn't bring herself to pay. The lessons Sarah had learned from Margaret's experience went far beyond the specific details of an abusive marriage. She'd understood intuitively that conventional marriage, even at its best, required women to accept limitations on their autonomy that men would never tolerate for themselves. The legal and social structures that governed married life were designed to subordinate wives to husbands in ways that could transform even well-intentioned men into tyrants and reduce even strong women to compliance with expectations that denied their fundamental humanity. Rebecca's letter from Margaret contained an update that made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar dread. Margaret's husband had died the previous winter, leaving her a widow with modest financial resources but no real preparation for independent life. At 45 years old, Margaret was discovering that decades of enforced dependence had left her ill-equipped to manage her own affairs or make decisions about her future. The skills and confidence that marriage was supposed to protect her from needing to develop were exactly what she now required to survive as a widow. More troubling still, Margaret's letter revealed that she'd been experiencing what she delicately termed nervous difficulties since her husband's death. The freedom that should have been liberating felt overwhelming and frightening to someone who'd spent 20 years having every significant decision made for her. Margaret found herself paralyzed by choices that should have been simple, unable to trust her own judgment about matters that independent people handled routinely. The psychological damage from years of systematic subordination was proving more lasting and limiting than the legal constraints that had originally created it. Sarah read Margaret's letter with growing horror, recognizing in her aunt's description of widowhood the inevitable consequences of a life lived entirely according to other people's expectations. Margaret had traded her autonomy for security, her independence for social approval, and her authentic self for the role of proper wife. Now that the bargain had ended, she was discovering that the things she'd surrendered couldn't simply be reclaimed when circumstances changed. The atrophy of disuse had made her incapable of exercising the very capabilities that marriage had supposedly made unnecessary. The conversation that followed between Sarah and her mother revealed the depth of Rebecca's own fears about the choices women faced in their society. Rebecca had read Margaret's letter with the growing realization that her sister's fate could have been her own under slightly different circumstances. Rebecca's marriage to Thomas had been genuinely companionate, built on mutual respect and shared decision-making that had allowed her to maintain her sense of self while fulfilling her domestic responsibilities. But she understood how rare such marriages were and how easily even good intentions could be corrupted by legal and social structures that assumed male authority and female submission. Rebecca's defense of Samuel Brooks became more nuanced as she acknowledged the legitimate concerns that Margaret's experience raised about conventional marriage. She still believed that Samuel was fundamentally different from Margaret's husband, that his character and upbringing would prevent him from becoming the kind of man who would crush his wife's spirit through systematic domination. But she also admitted that there were no guarantees about how any man might change once he possessed the legal and social authority that marriage would give him over Sarah's life. The discussion of Margaret's situation forced Sarah to articulate her fears about marriage more clearly than she'd been able to do before. It wasn't Samuel specifically that she feared, but the institution itself and the way it was structured to subordinate women's interests to men's preferences. Even if Samuel remained the kind and considerate man he appeared to be, marriage would still legally transfer most of Sarah's rights and freedoms to his control. Her property would become his, her choices would require his approval, and her future would depend entirely on his continued benevolence. Sarah's growing understanding of the legal realities of marriage had been one of the factors that made Jacob's challenge so appealing. Wilderness life would require her to develop and maintain exactly the kinds of capabilities that conventional marriage was designed to make unnecessary. Instead of trading her independence for protection, she would be choosing to develop the skills and strength necessary to protect herself. Rather than accepting dependence in exchange for security, she would be building the kind of self-sufficiency that could provide genuine security regardless of changing circumstances. The parallel between Margaret's current situation and what Sarah's life might become if she chose differently was impossible to ignore. Margaret had made all the sensible choices, accepting all the conventional wisdom about women's proper roles and the security that marriage provided. She'd been the dutiful daughter, the compliant wife, and the proper society matron. But when circumstances changed and she was forced to depend on her own resources, she discovered that conventional life had systematically weakened exactly the capabilities she most needed. Sarah's aunt had been protected from developing independence, shielded from making difficult decisions, and encouraged to focus on social accomplishments rather than practical skills. The result was a woman who was highly educated in matters of little substance but completely unprepared for the realities of autonomous life. Margaret could plan elaborate dinner parties and manage complex social situations, but she couldn't balance her own accounts, negotiate with tradesmen, or make investment decisions about her modest inheritance. The very protection that marriage had provided had become a form of prison that continued to constrain her even after her husband's death. The weight of Margaret's cautionary tale settled over Sarah like a heavy cloak as she contemplated the choice between Samuel's proposal and Jacob's challenge. Her aunt's experience demonstrated that even the most advantageous conventional marriage could become a trap that left women unprepared for the realities of independent life. The security that marriage promised was revealed as a form of managed dependence that could prove more limiting than protective when circumstances inevitably changed. Sarah found herself thinking about the women of Pine Ridge with new eyes, assessing their situations through the lens of Margaret's experience. Most of them seemed content with their domestic roles, finding satisfaction in managing households and raising children according to established patterns. But Sarah wondered how many of them had surrendered dreams and capabilities in exchange for the security of conventional marriage, and what would happen to them if they were suddenly forced to depend on resources they'd been encouraged to neglect. The conversation with her mother about Margaret's situation also revealed Rebecca's own complicated relationship with the choices she'd made in her youth. Rebecca had been lucky in her marriage to Thomas, finding a partner who valued her intelligence and included her in important decisions. But she also acknowledged that her happiness had depended largely on Thomas's character rather than on any structural protections that ensured wives would be treated as equal partners in marriage. She'd been fortunate, but fortune wasn't something a woman could count on when making decisions that would affect the rest of her life. Rebecca's advice to Sarah reflected this complex understanding of marriage's potential benefits and risks. She still believed that the right marriage could provide genuine happiness and security, but she also understood why Sarah might want something different from conventional domestic life. The key, Rebecca suggested, was finding a man who would value Sarah's strength rather than seeking to diminish it, someone who would see her independence as an asset rather than a threat to his authority. But Sarah's conversations with Jacob had shown her a different possibility entirely, one that didn't require her to depend on any man's enlightened attitudes toward women's capabilities. Wilderness life would demand that she develop and maintain complete self-sufficiency, ensuring that her security and happiness depended on her own skills and determination rather than on someone else's continued benevolence. The risks were certainly greater, but they were honest risks that she could assess and manage through her own efforts rather than hidden dangers that depended on factors beyond her control. The contrast between Margaret's fate and Jacob's challenge crystallized Sarah's understanding of what she truly wanted from life. Margaret had chosen safety and ended up trapped by the very protections she'd sought. Sarah could choose uncertainty and risk, but in doing so she would also choose the opportunity to develop capabilities that no change in circumstances could take away from her. The strength and skills that wilderness life demanded would belong to her permanently, providing a form of security that no external arrangement could match. Sarah's growing certainty about rejecting Samuel's proposal was strengthened by her recognition that accepting it would require her to ignore everything that Margaret's experience had taught her about the hidden costs of conventional choices. She couldn't unknow what she now understood about the way marriage was structured to subordinate women's interests to men's preferences. She couldn't pretend that even the most benevolent husband wouldn't possess legal and social authority that could be used to constrain her choices if his attitudes changed or if conflicts arose between his preferences and her needs. The decision was becoming clearer despite its obvious risks and the disappointment it would cause her family. Sarah was beginning to understand that choosing wilderness life wasn't just about accepting Jacob's specific challenge but about refusing to accept limitations on what she could become as a person. Margaret's letter had demonstrated that conventional choices could be just as dangerous as unconventional ones, but in ways that were hidden until it was too late to develop alternatives. The afternoon Sarah spent rereading Margaret's letter and contemplating its implications marked a turning point in her thinking about her future. She'd been wrestling with the choice between security and adventure, between conventional success and personal authenticity. But Margaret's experience revealed that the security offered by conventional choices was often illusory, dependent on circumstances beyond a woman's control and purchased at the cost of developing the very capabilities that could provide genuine security. Sarah's decision to seek another meeting with Jacob was motivated by her need to understand more clearly what wilderness life could offer beyond adventure and challenge. She wanted to know whether the strength and independence that such a life demanded would provide the kind of lasting security that Margaret's conventional choices had failed to deliver. The risks of wilderness living were obvious and immediate, but they were also honest risks that could be assessed and managed through competence and preparation. When Sarah returned to the forest clearing where she'd first encountered Jacob, she carried with her a new understanding of what was truly at stake in choosing between the life he offered and the future that Pine Ridge society expected her to embrace. It wasn't simply a matter of choosing between comfort and hardship or between security and adventure. It was a choice between two fundamentally different approaches to building a life, one that emphasized dependence on external protections and one that focused on developing internal resources. Jacob was waiting for her when she arrived, as if he'd sensed that their previous conversations had initiated a process that would inevitably bring her back for a final discussion. His greeting was characteristically direct, acknowledging that something had changed in her thinking without requiring explanation of what had caused the shift. Sarah appreciated his restraint in not pressing for details about her family situation or the social pressures she was facing in Pine Ridge. The conversation that followed was different from their previous meetings, focused less on practical considerations and more on fundamental questions about how to live a meaningful life in an uncertain world. Sarah described Margaret's situation without revealing family connections, presenting it as an example of what could happen to women who made choices based on conventional wisdom about security and protection. Jacob listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking questions that revealed his understanding of the broader social forces that shaped women's options in civilized society. Jacob's response to Margaret's story demonstrated his awareness that the choice he was offering Sarah wasn't simply about lifestyle preferences but about fundamental questions of autonomy and self-determination. He acknowledged that wilderness life offered no guarantees of safety or success, but he also pointed out that conventional life's promises of security were often illusory, dependent on circumstances and other people's choices rather than on one's own capabilities and preparation. The mountain man's perspective on independence was more nuanced than Sarah had initially realized. He wasn't advocating for isolation as an end in itself but for the development of self-sufficiency as a foundation for genuine relationships and authentic choice. A person who could survive and thrive independently was free to choose partnerships and commitments based on genuine compatibility and shared values rather than on necessity or social pressure. The strength that wilderness living developed became a source of freedom rather than a barrier to connection. Sarah found herself drawn to Jacob's description of the psychological transformation that accompanied the development of complete self-reliance. Learning to depend entirely on one's own judgment and capabilities didn't just provide practical benefits, it fundamentally changed a person's relationship with themselves and their environment. The confidence that came from knowing one could handle whatever challenges arose created a kind of inner peace that was impossible to achieve through external securities that could be lost or taken away. The conversation gradually moved toward the specific terms of Jacob's challenge, the practical arrangements that would be necessary if Sarah decided to accept his offer of partnership in wilderness living. He described the process of gradual transition that would allow her to develop necessary skills while maintaining some connection to civilized society until she was ready for complete independence. The plan he outlined was methodical and realistic, acknowledging both the magnitude of the change he was proposing and the importance of adequate preparation for such a significant transition. Jacob's proposal wasn't simply an invitation to join him in his established life but an offer to build something new together that would incorporate both of their strengths and perspectives. He recognized that Sarah's education and social background would bring valuable capabilities to wilderness living just as his experience and knowledge would provide essential guidance for her transition. The partnership he envisioned would be one of equals, each contributing different but equally important resources to their shared enterprise. The financial aspects of Jacob's proposal revealed his understanding that genuine independence required economic as well as physical self-sufficiency. He described the various ways that mountain men generated income through trapping, guiding, and trading, explaining how Sarah could develop her own economic activities that would contribute to their shared prosperity. The goal wasn't simply survival but the creation of a sustainable lifestyle that would provide both security and satisfaction without dependence on conventional social or economic structures. Sarah's questions about the social implications of choosing wilderness life revealed her continuing concern about the impact her decision would have on her family and community. Jacob's response demonstrated his respect for these concerns while also helping her understand that loyalty to family didn't require sacrificing her authentic self to meet their expectations. The greatest gift she could give her family, he suggested, might be demonstrating that it was possible to live successfully according to one's own values rather than conventional wisdom. The discussion of timing revealed Jacob's understanding that such a significant decision couldn't be rushed despite the various pressures Sarah was facing from Pine Ridge society. He offered to provide additional opportunities for her to experience wilderness living gradually, allowing her to test her commitment and develop confidence in her choice before making final commitments that would be difficult to reverse. The patient approach he suggested demonstrated his genuine concern for her welfare rather than simply his desire for companionship. As their conversation drew toward a conclusion, Sarah realized that her decision had essentially been made during the process of serious discussion with someone who understood both the challenges and rewards of the life she was contemplating. Jacob's challenge had provided her with a framework for understanding her dissatisfaction with conventional options, but more importantly, it had shown her a path toward developing the kind of strength and independence that could provide genuine security regardless of changing circumstances. The commitment Sarah made that afternoon wasn't simply to accept Jacob's specific offer but to embrace a completely different philosophy of how to build a meaningful life. Instead of seeking protection through dependence on external securities, she would develop the capabilities necessary to create her own security through competence and self-reliance. Instead of accepting limitations on her potential in exchange for social approval, she would choose growth and challenge even when the outcomes were uncertain. When Sarah finally spoke her acceptance of Jacob's challenge, the words felt like both an ending and a beginning. She was closing the door on the conventional future that Pine Ridge society expected her to embrace, but she was also opening herself to possibilities that would test and develop every capability she possessed. The choice required courage, but it also promised the kind of authentic existence that conventional wisdom insisted was impossible for women to achieve independently. Jacob's response to her acceptance was characteristically restrained, acknowledging the significance of her decision without dramatic celebration or excessive emotion. He understood that commitment was just the beginning of a process that would require sustained effort and determination to achieve successfully. The real test of Sarah's choice would come in the months ahead as she began the practical work of transforming herself from a settler's daughter into a woman strong enough for the wilderness. The plans they made that afternoon were detailed and realistic, taking into account both the practical requirements of Sarah's transition and the social complexities of extracting herself from Pine Ridge expectations. Jacob's experience with the frontier had taught him that successful life changes required careful preparation and gradual implementation rather than dramatic gestures that created unnecessary complications. The approach they outlined would give Sarah time to develop essential skills while managing the inevitable conflicts that her choice would create with family and community expectations. As Sarah prepared to return to Pine Ridge for what would be one of her final times as a conventional settler's daughter, she felt the calm certainty that comes with making a difficult decision and knowing it's the right one. The path ahead would be challenging in ways she couldn't fully anticipate, but it would be her path chosen according to her own values and pursued through her own efforts. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly free to become whoever she was meant to be without limitations imposed by other people's ideas about what women could or should achieve. The breaking point came on a crisp October morning when Samuel Brooks arrived at the Mitchell farm with his mother and Reverend Hayes, their faces bearing the solemn determination of people prepared to stage an intervention for Sarah's own good. Word had reached them about her frequent absences from town, her distracted behavior during social gatherings, and her continued reluctance to provide a definitive answer to Samuel's proposal. The community had reached a consensus that Sarah was suffering from some form of nervous condition brought on by the stresses of frontier life, and they decided that decisive action was needed to guide her back towards sensible choices. Martha Brooks took the lead in the conversation, her voice carrying the authority of a woman accustomed to managing social situations for the benefit of everyone involved. She spoke kindly but firmly about the concerns that Sarah's behavior had raised among Pine Ridge's leading families, emphasizing that everyone understood how overwhelming the transition to frontier life could be for a young woman of refined sensibilities. The solution Martha suggested was for Sarah to accept the stability and protection that Samuel's proposal offered, allowing her to settle into the secure routine of married life that would cure whatever uncertainties were currently troubling her peace of mind. Reverend Hayes contributed his spiritual perspective to the intervention, framing Sarah's hesitation as a crisis of faith that could be resolved through prayer and submission to divine will as expressed through community wisdom. He reminded Sarah that God had placed her in Pine Ridge for a purpose, surrounded her with people who cared about her welfare, and provided her with an opportunity for happiness that many young women would envy. To reject such blessings, the Reverend implied, would be not just foolish but potentially sinful, representing a dangerous pride that placed personal desires above divine providence and community harmony. Samuel's contribution to the conversation revealed how deeply her uncertainty had wounded his pride and confused his understanding of what their relationship meant. He'd interpreted her request for time as a polite way of expressing reservations about his character or prospects, and he'd spent weeks trying to determine what additional assurances or commitments he could offer to overcome whatever obstacles were preventing her acceptance. His genuine bewilderment at her continued hesitation demonstrated how completely he misunderstood the nature of her objections to conventional marriage. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of defending a decision she couldn't fully explain without revealing information that would scandalize everyone present. How could she tell these well-meaning people that she'd been meeting secretly with a mountain man who'd offered her a completely different vision of what her life could become? How could she explain that their assumptions about what constituted security and happiness were exactly what she was trying to escape? The very foundations of their advice rested on beliefs about women's proper roles and natural limitations that Sarah had come to question fundamentally. The intervention continued for over an hour, with each participant offering variations on the same basic theme that Sarah's best interests lay in accepting the conventional path that Samuel's proposal represented, and that her reluctance to embrace this obvious solution indicated confused thinking that required correction by wiser heads. The circular nature of their arguments revealed how completely they'd failed to consider that Sarah might have legitimate reasons for wanting something different from what they assumed all sensible women desired. Rebecca Mitchell's participation in the intervention was the most painful aspect of the entire ordeal for Sarah. Her mother's support for the community's position felt like a betrayal of their previous conversations about Margaret's experience and the risks that conventional marriage could pose for women who valued their independence. But Sarah gradually realized that Rebecca's support for Samuel's proposal came from genuine fear about what would happen to her daughter if she rejected the security that marriage offered without having any alternative means of support. The breaking point came when Martha Brooks suggested that Sarah's family might want to consider seeking medical consultation for what appeared to be an increasingly serious case of nervous hysteria. The casual pathologizing of Sarah's reluctance to conform to expectations revealed how thoroughly the community was prepared to dismiss any perspective that challenged their assumptions about what constituted normal female behavior. The implication was clear: if Sarah couldn't be persuaded to make the sensible choice, her capacity for rational decision-making would be questioned until she could be guided toward compliance. Sarah's response to the intervention surprised everyone present, including herself. Instead of the defensive explanations or emotional outbursts that might have been expected from a young woman under such pressure, she spoke with calm clarity about her appreciation for their concern and her recognition that their advice came from genuine care for her welfare. But she also made it clear that she understood her own mind better than they assumed, and that her reluctance to accept Samuel's proposal came from carefully considered reasons rather than confused thinking or nervous instability. The conversation that followed Sarah's measured response revealed the depth of the philosophical divide between her emerging worldview and the community's settled assumptions about women's proper roles and natural limitations. Samuel couldn't understand how any woman could prefer uncertainty to the security he offered. Martha Brooks couldn't comprehend why Sarah would risk social disapproval for the sake of vague personal preferences. Reverend Hayes couldn't accept that a properly raised Christian woman would place individual desires above community wisdom and divine providence. Sarah's attempt to explain her perspective without revealing her specific plans met with polite but firm resistance from her well-meaning advisors. They interpreted her talk of wanting to develop her full potential as evidence of dangerous pride, her interest in unconventional possibilities as proof of unrealistic thinking, and her emphasis on personal authenticity as selfish disregard for family and community obligations. Every value that Jacob had helped her recognize as legitimate was dismissed as evidence of confused priorities that required correction. The intervention concluded with an ultimatum disguised as loving concern. Samuel would extend his proposal for one more week, giving Sarah additional time to reconsider her position and recognize the advantages of accepting his offer. If she continued to refuse his suit after this final grace period, he would be forced to withdraw his proposal and seek a more appreciative partner elsewhere. The implication was clear: this was Sarah's last chance to make the sensible choice, and if she failed to take advantage of it, she would have to live with the consequences of her unreasonable behavior. After the delegation departed, Sarah found herself alone with her parents for a conversation that would determine whether she could count on their support for the choice she was preparing to make. Thomas Mitchell had remained largely silent during the intervention, but his expression suggested that he was wrestling with conflicting impulses about his daughter's situation.
Rebecca's obvious distress made it clear that Sarah's decision would not only affect her own future but would also strain family relationships in ways that might prove difficult to repair. The discussion that followed was
the most honest conversation Sarah had ever had with her parents about her deepest fears and strongest desires. She spoke openly about her observations of women in conventional marriages, her concerns about the legal and social constraints that marriage would place on her autonomy, and her growing certainty that she needed to find a different path toward security and fulfillment. She described her meetings with Jacob in general terms, emphasizing his knowledge and capabilities rather than the specific nature of his challenge. Thomas's response revealed that he understood his daughter's concerns better than Sarah had expected. His own restless spirit had been shaped by similar desires for authentic challenge and meaningful accomplishment, and he recognized that Sarah had inherited both his adventurous nature and his intolerance for artificial limitations. But he also understood the practical realities that made conventional choices safer for women, even when those choices required sacrificing personal dreams for social security. Rebecca's fears centered on the dangers that unconventional choices posed for women without family connections or financial resources to fall back on if their independence proved unsustainable. She'd seen too many women destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, and she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter facing such risks without the protection that marriage could provide. Her opposition to Sarah's emerging plans came from maternal love rather than lack of understanding, but it was no less powerful for being motivated by genuine concern. The family conference that continued late into the evening revealed that Sarah's choice would require her to disappoint people she loved while pursuing a path that offered no guarantees of success or safety. Thomas and Rebecca both acknowledged that their daughter had the right to make her own decisions about her future, but they also made it clear that they couldn't support choices that seemed designed to ensure hardship and social isolation. The emotional cost of pursuing authentic life would include the pain of family disapproval and the loss of the security that came from community acceptance. Sarah's final conversation with her parents marked the end of her childhood in ways that went far beyond simple age or legal status. She was choosing to accept complete responsibility for her own life, including the consequences of decisions that might prove disastrous despite her best intentions and careful planning. The conversation concluded with tears and embraces, but also with the understanding that Sarah's choice would create a fundamental change in family relationships that couldn't be undone regardless of how her adventure ultimately concluded. The week that followed was simultaneously the longest and shortest of Sarah's life. During daylight hours she went through the motions of normal settlement life while secretly making preparations for her departure. She gathered essential supplies, arranged for the disposition of personal belongings she couldn't take with her, and completed the practical tasks that would allow her to leave Pine Ridge without creating unnecessary complications for her family. The deception felt uncomfortable, but it also protected her parents from having to choose between supporting her unconventional plans and maintaining their position in the community. Jacob appeared at their designated meeting place precisely when he'd promised, leading a sturdy mountain horse packed with supplies for their journey into the high country. His greeting acknowledged the significance of what Sarah was undertaking without unnecessary drama or excessive emotion. He understood that commitment was just the beginning of a process that would test every aspect of her character and capabilities, and he was prepared to provide guidance and support without removing the challenges that would ultimately determine whether she possessed the strength for wilderness living. The journey to Jacob's hidden valley took 3 days of travel through terrain that grew progressively more difficult and spectacular with each mile they covered. Sarah's riding skills, developed during her comfortable Illinois childhood, proved adequate for the early stages of their trip but required constant improvement as they encountered mountain trails that demanded expert horsemanship and absolute confidence. Jacob's patient instruction revealed his understanding that Sarah's education in wilderness living would require time and practice rather than dramatic transformation. The physical demands of mountain travel were unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her previous life, requiring endurance, balance, and mental toughness that tested her commitment to the choice she'd made. But the beauty of the landscape they traversed also revealed why Jacob had chosen this life over conventional alternatives. The vast emptiness of the high country, the crystal clarity of mountain air, and the profound silence that surrounded them during rest stops created an environment that seemed to strip away artificial concerns and focus attention on essential realities. Jacob's instruction during their journey covered practical skills like reading weather signs, managing horses in difficult terrain, and making camp efficiently in various conditions. But it also included broader lessons about the mental disciplines that wilderness living required, the importance of constant attention to environmental changes, and the development of judgment skills that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Every aspect of mountain travel became an opportunity for learning that would contribute to Sarah's eventual independence. The hidden valley that Jacob had described in their previous conversations exceeded Sarah's expectations in every way that mattered. The natural fortress created by surrounding peaks provided both security and privacy, while the fertile soil and reliable water sources made genuine self-sufficiency possible rather than merely theoretical. The cabin Jacob had built represented years of careful planning and skilled craftsmanship, creating a home that combined comfort with functionality in ways that demonstrated the possibilities for civilized living in wilderness settings. Sarah's first weeks in the valley revealed both the challenges and rewards of the life she'd chosen to embrace. The physical demands of wilderness living required her to develop strength and endurance far beyond anything her previous life had demanded, but the work also provided direct satisfaction in ways that social obligations never had. Every task contributed obviously to her survival and comfort, creating a sense of purpose that conventional domestic duties had never provided. The psychological adjustment to isolation proved more complex than Sarah had anticipated, requiring mental disciplines that took time to develop fully. The silence of the valley could be overwhelming during her first days when she found herself listening constantly for sounds that never came. But gradually she learned to appreciate the peace that came with living entirely according to natural rhythms rather than social schedules, finding satisfaction in simple activities that would have seemed boring during her previous life. Jacob's role during Sarah's transition period was carefully calibrated to provide necessary guidance without creating dependence that would undermine her development of self-reliance. He shared his knowledge freely but required her to practice skills until she could perform them independently. He offered emotional support during difficult moments but also challenged her to develop the mental toughness that wilderness living demanded. The partnership that emerged was one of equals working toward shared goals rather than teacher and student or protector and dependent. The seasonal cycles of mountain living revealed themselves gradually as Sarah learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changing weather patterns and shifting wildlife behavior. Fall brought the intensive preparation necessary for winter survival, including hunting for meat preservation, gathering wild foods for storage, and completing construction projects before cold weather made outdoor work impossible. The urgency of these preparations created natural deadlines that focused attention and energy in ways that social obligations never had. Winter isolation in the valley proved to be both the greatest challenge and the most profound reward of wilderness living. For months at a time, Sarah and Jacob were completely cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on their own resources for survival and entertainment. But the enforced solitude also created opportunities for deep conversation, intensive skill development, and the kind of sustained attention to important projects that was impossible during busier seasons. Spring's arrival brought not just relief from winter's constraints but also confirmation that Sarah had successfully made the transition from settlement life to genuine wilderness independence. She'd survived her first mountain winter, developed essential skills to a level of genuine competence, and discovered that the strength she'd always suspected lived within her was real enough to sustain her through serious challenges. The woman who emerged from winter isolation was fundamentally different from the settler's daughter who'd left Pine Ridge the previous fall. The letter that arrived with the spring supply trip contained news from Pine Ridge that confirmed Sarah had made the right choice despite its obvious costs. Samuel Brooks had married the daughter of a newly arrived merchant family, finding in his new wife exactly the kind of conventional partner who would support his social and business ambitions. Rebecca Mitchell had recovered from her initial distress about Sarah's departure and was beginning to express pride in her daughter's courage and independence. Thomas Mitchell had openly admitted that he envied Sarah's freedom to pursue authentic challenges rather than social expectations. Sarah's response to news from her former life revealed how completely her perspective had shifted during her year in the mountains. The concerns that had once seemed so important now felt distant and artificial, while the daily realities of wilderness living provided satisfaction and meaning that conventional success could never match. She'd discovered that the strength Jacob had recognized in her was real enough to sustain not just survival but genuine flourishing in conditions that would have overwhelmed the person she'd been before accepting his challenge. The partnership that had developed between Sarah and Jacob transcended the categories that civilized society used to define relationships between men and women. They were equals in ways that legal marriage could never create, sharing responsibilities and decision-making based on individual capabilities rather than social conventions. The respect they developed for each other's strengths created a foundation for intimacy that was both deeper and more honest than anything based on romantic sentiment or economic necessity.
As Sarah stood in the valley that had become her true home, watching the morning mist rise from the creek where she'd first encountered Jacob, she understood that the choice she'd made had given her exactly what she'd been seeking without knowing how to name it. She'd found a way to live authentically according to her own values, to develop capabilities that belonged to her permanently, and to build something meaningful with someone who valued her strength rather than seeking to diminish it. The woman who'd been strong enough for the wilderness had discovered that wilderness was strong enough to transform her into someone she'd always had the potential to become but had never been allowed to express fully. The mountains had given her exactly what Jacob had promised, the opportunity to find out who she really was when stripped of artificial limitations and social expectations. The answer had exceeded even her own hopes for what was possible when courage met opportunity in a place where only authentic strength could survive and thrive. The transformation was complete on a golden September morning 2 years later when Sarah Mitchell Carter stood at the edge of their expanded homestead, watching Jacob teach their 6-month-old daughter to recognize the calls of different mountain birds. The woman who had once struggled with the basic skills of wilderness survival now moved through the high country with the fluid confidence of someone born to mountain living, her calloused hands and sun-weathered face telling the story of countless days spent in harmony with forces that had once seemed impossibly challenging. Little Anna Carter gurgled with delight as her father imitated the distinctive whistle of a mountain chickadee, her bright eyes already showing signs of the alertness that wilderness children develop naturally. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction watching Jacob's patient instruction, knowing that their daughter would grow up understanding the language of wind and weather, the significance of animal tracks and the subtle signs that revealed the mountain's changing moods. Anna would never know the fear of depending on others for her security because she would learn from birth that true strength came from understanding and working with the natural world rather than trying to dominate or escape it. The cabin that had once seemed rustic and primitive now felt like the most civilized dwelling Sarah had ever inhabited, every room designed for maximum efficiency and comfort within the constraints of mountain living. The furniture they'd crafted together during long winter evenings reflected both functionality and beauty, proving that wilderness life didn't require sacrificing aesthetic pleasure for practical necessity. The shelves lined with books, the carefully tended herb garden visible through the kitchen window, and the musical instruments that provided evening entertainment all demonstrated that isolation didn't mean cultural poverty. Sarah's skills had developed far beyond what either she or Jacob had initially imagined possible. She could track game through difficult terrain, preserve meat through various traditional methods, identify and prepare dozens of medicinal plants, and navigate mountain trails that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen. More importantly, she'd developed the mental resilience and practical judgment that allowed her to handle emergencies independently, whether that meant treating injuries with improvised materials or making life or death decisions about weather and travel without hesitation or second-guessing. The economic independence they'd achieved together exceeded anything Sarah could have accomplished within conventional society's limitations. Their reputation for quality furs, reliable guiding services, and expert knowledge of mountain conditions had created a network of trading relationships that provided both steady income and access to manufactured goods they couldn't produce themselves. Sarah's contributions to their economic success included not just practical skills but also the social capabilities that her education had provided, allowing them to negotiate favorable terms with traders and establish relationships with other mountain families. The letters that arrived with supply trains brought news of Pine Ridge's continued growth and prosperity, along with updates about people who had once seemed central to Sarah's world but now felt like characters from a story she'd read long ago. Samuel Brooks had become the town's leading citizen, his banking business expanding to serve mining operations throughout the region. Rebecca and Thomas Mitchell had sold their farm and moved into town, where Thomas served as the local magistrate and Rebecca had become a respected community leader known for her charitable work and practical wisdom. But the most significant news came in a letter from Margaret Sullivan, who had finally found the courage to leave Chicago and establish a small school for girls in Denver. Margaret's transformation from helpless widow to independent educator demonstrated that it was never too late to reclaim autonomy and build authentic meaning, even after years of living according to other people's expectations. Her letter to Sarah was filled with gratitude for the example of courage that Sarah's choices had provided, inspiring Margaret to believe that women could indeed create their own security through competence and determination rather than dependence on male protection. The community of mountain families that Sarah and Jacob had become part of represented a completely different model of social organization than anything Sarah had experienced in conventional society. Instead of rigid hierarchies based on wealth or social position, relationships were built on mutual respect for individual capabilities and contributions. Women were valued for their strength and skills rather than their compliance with artificial standards of feminine behavior. Children learned from multiple adults who shared knowledge freely, creating educational opportunities that far exceeded what formal schooling could provide in isolated locations. Sarah's role in this mountain community had evolved naturally from her specific talents and interests rather than being predetermined by gender expectations. She served as the informal medical practitioner for families within traveling distance, her knowledge of herbs and healing techniques making her invaluable during emergencies when professional medical help was days away. She also functioned as a teacher for children whose families wanted education that went beyond basic literacy, providing instruction in history, literature and mathematics that would prepare them for whatever futures they chose to pursue. The seasonal rhythms that governed mountain life had become as natural to Sarah as breathing, each transition bringing its own satisfactions and challenges that kept life interesting without creating the artificial stress that seemed to characterize civilized society. Spring meant emergence from winter's cocoon, the excitement of assessing what had survived the harsh months and planning improvements for the year ahead. Summer brought the intense activity of building and preparing, taking advantage of favorable weather to accomplish everything that would be impossible during darker months. Fall remained Sarah's favorite season, when the urgent preparations for winter created natural deadlines that focused attention and energy in deeply satisfying ways. The process of hunting, gathering, and preserving food for the cold months ahead provided concrete evidence of competence and foresight that conventional work rarely offered. Every jar of preserved vegetables, every piece of properly cured meat, every cord of split firewood represented security that had been earned through personal effort rather than purchased with money earned in abstract transactions. Winter itself had become a time of profound satisfaction rather than mere endurance, offering opportunities for deep conversation, intensive craft work and the kind of sustained attention to important projects that was impossible during busier seasons. The enforced solitude that had once seemed frightening now felt like a luxury, providing uninterrupted time for reading, planning and developing skills that required concentration and practice. The intimacy that winter isolation created between family members was deeper and more genuine than anything Sarah had experienced in social settings where conversation was constantly interrupted by artificial obligations. Jacob's partnership with Sarah had evolved into something that transcended conventional categories for relationships between men and women. They were equals in ways that legal marriage could never create, sharing decision-making and responsibilities based on individual strengths rather than social expectations. The respect they developed for each other's capabilities provided a foundation for intimacy that was both deeper and more honest than anything based on romantic sentiment or economic necessity. Their daughter would grow up seeing partnership modeled as mutual support between strong individuals rather than protection of weak dependence by dominant providers. The physical transformation that mountain living had wrought in Sarah was dramatic but secondary to the psychological changes that had occurred during her years in the wilderness. She moved with the confident grace of someone whose body had been shaped by meaningful work, her posture and gestures reflecting the kind of strength that came from facing genuine challenges rather than artificial exercises. But more significantly, she carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of achieving, and had proven that knowledge through sustained testing under difficult conditions. Sarah's reunion with her parents during their visit to the valley the previous summer had confirmed that her choice to embrace wilderness life had affected not just her own development but also her family's understanding of what was possible for women who refused to accept conventional limitations. Rebecca Mitchell had initially been shocked by the physical changes in her daughter, but she gradually recognized that Sarah's obvious happiness and competence represented genuine success rather than temporary adventure that would eventually require rescue or retreat. Thomas Mitchell's response to his daughter's transformation had been unambiguously positive, his own adventurous spirit recognizing and celebrating the authentic achievement that Sarah's wilderness mastery represented. He'd spent hours learning from Jacob about mountain survival techniques and had openly expressed his admiration for the life they'd built together. More importantly, he'd acknowledged that Sarah had found exactly what she'd been seeking when she'd rejected Samuel Brooks's proposal and chosen uncertainty over security. The visit from her parents had also provided Sarah with an opportunity to demonstrate that choosing wilderness life hadn't required her to abandon all connection with the civilized world or reject everything valuable about her upbringing. She could still discuss literature and current events with intelligence and insight, still appreciate music and art, still maintain the social graces that made interaction pleasant. But these civilized accomplishments had been integrated into a life that was fundamentally shaped by authentic challenges rather than artificial conventions. The legacy that Sarah was creating through her choices extended beyond her own personal fulfillment to influence other women who learned about her example through stories that traveled along trading routes and family networks. Young women facing pressure to accept conventional marriages began to understand that alternatives existed for those with sufficient courage to pursue them. Wives trapped in unsatisfying relationships found inspiration in Sarah's demonstration that it was possible to build security through competence rather than dependence. Even women who chose to remain within conventional society were emboldened to assert more autonomy within their traditional roles. The mountain community's response to Sarah's example had been to recognize and encourage similar strength in other women who found their way to the high country. Several families included wives who had chosen wilderness life over conventional alternatives, creating a network of women who supported each other's continued development of capabilities that civilized society discouraged. These relationships provided Sarah with friendships based on shared values and mutual respect rather than social proximity or artificial common interests. Anna Carter's presence in the valley represented the ultimate validation of Sarah's choice to embrace wilderness life rather than accept conventional security. The little girl was developing with the kind of confident curiosity that came from growing up in an environment where her capabilities were encouraged rather than limited by gender expectations. She would learn to ride and hunt and build with the same competence expected of any mountain child, but she would also receive the intellectual education that Sarah's background could provide. Anna would never have to choose between strength and femininity because she would understand that true femininity included whatever capabilities a woman chose to develop. As Sarah watched the golden light of evening settle over the peaks that had become her true home, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she'd found her place in the world through her own courage and determination. The choice to reject Samuel Brooks's proposal and accept Jacob's challenge had required her to risk everything she'd been taught to value, but it had also given her everything she'd never dared to hope she could achieve. She'd become exactly who she was meant to be by choosing authenticity over approval, growth over comfort, and partnership over protection. The woman who had been strong enough for the wilderness had discovered that wilderness was strong enough to reveal and develop capabilities that conventional society never would have allowed her to express. The mountains had given her exactly what Jacob had promised during that first encounter by the creek, the opportunity to find out who she really was when stripped of artificial limitations and social expectations. The answer had exceeded even her own hopes for what was possible when genuine strength met authentic challenge in a place where only truth could survive and flourish. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.